The first time my wife fed me like a child in public, it was at a restaurant where a single piece of fish cost more than my first month's rent. The ceiling was low and black, the kind they use to make everything feel closer, more intimate, more expensive. Soft light pooled over each table like a private spotlight. The air smelled of soy and charcoal, of seared wagyu and polished money. Chopsticks clicked softly, glasses rang, and somewhere in the background a jazz piano tried very hard not to be noticed. I sat at the center of it all like some museum exhibit, an old man propped up in a tailored suit that fit just a little too loosely now. In front of me, on a stone platter that probably had its own passport, lay neat slices of beef marbled white as winter branches. Lydia lifted one between her chopsticks, her nails pale and perfect against the black lacquer. She turned toward me with a smile that made nearby diners soften and tilt their heads with admiration. "Open wide, darling," she cooed. "You know you need your protein." She spoke just a little too loudly, the way people do around toddlers and the very old. A couple at the next table glanced over and smiled appreciatively at her devotion. An older woman pressed a hand to her heart as if she might cry. They saw a scene from a sentimental commercial, the young, glamorous wife caring for her declining, beloved husband. No one saw the way Lydia's fingers dug into my shoulder, just out of their line of sight. The tiny pinch of impatience that said cooperate. I opened my mouth and let her feed me the 5-star meat as though I had forgotten how to use my own hands. It melted across my tongue, rich and perfect, but I barely tasted it. I chewed slowly, obediently, letting my gaze drift somewhere over her shoulder. My hand, resting on the tablecloth beside the plate, trembled just enough to make the silverware rattle. "He's been getting so forgetful lately," Lydia said, turning those big green eyes toward the man seated across from us. "But he loves this place. Don't you, Harrison?" I blinked and summoned a thin, papery voice. "Oh yes. Very nice," I murmured, dragging the words out as if I had to haul them up from the bottom of a well. The man opposite me smiled with all the practiced warmth of a salesman on closing day. His name was Kenji Sato, mid-40s, flawless navy suit, wristwatch that cost more than most cars. His hair was styled just so, his skin smooth, his tie knotted with the kind of precision that suggested a personal valet rather than a YouTube tutorial. His eyes, though, were sharp as broken glass. He leaned forward, elbows carefully off the table, and folded his hands. "Mr. Caldwell," he said in perfect, unaccented English, "it is an honor to meet you. Lydia has told me so much about your legacy." There was the faintest hesitation before that last word, like a pianist pausing on a sour note. Legacy. A polite way of saying the empire you built when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I forced my lips into something that could pass for a smile. "Very kind of you, young man," I said, letting a small quiver creep into my tone. "I'm afraid I don't keep up with business talk the way I used to." Lydia's hand fluttered over mine, patting it twice, the way you might reassure a dog at the vet. "He gets confused," she said, dropping her voice just enough to make it seem like a confidence while ensuring the nearby tables could still hear. "But he loves being included. Don't you, sweetheart?" I stared at my water glass, at the way the light fractured in it, and let my eyes go vague. If you didn't know better, you would have thought my mind had already left the room and only the body remained, propped up in a suit while my wife narrated my decline for the benefit of strangers. Lydia laughed, high and tinkling, as some joke slid past me. Kenji chuckled along dutifully. I did not. I had learned long ago, in boardrooms and on docksides, that silence can be safer than speech. Tonight it was my only weapon. Our waiter arrived, bowing low as he refilled the tiny porcelain cups at our elbows. Kenji lifted the sake bottle with an easy familiarity, poured for Lydia first, then for himself. The clear liquid caught the light like trapped stars. He set the bottle down, and as his hand withdrew, his eyes met Lydia's over the rim of his cup. Something passed between them, a flicker of heat that had nothing to do with alcohol. Her lips tilted at one corner. She looked away, a heartbeat too late. "I hope the noise is not too much for you, Mr. Caldwell," Kenji said smoothly. "These places can be overwhelming." "Oh, he doesn't mind," Lydia answered before I could. "Do you, Harrison? He barely notices what's going on around him these days." A few soft, sympathetic chuckles drifted from the next table. My hand shook on cue. The spoon on my plate chimed softly as it vibrated against the ceramic. Inside my chest, my heart beat a slow, measured rhythm. I had weathered market crashes, union strikes, hostile takeovers. I had stood on a freighter deck in the middle of the Pacific while a typhoon tried to throw me into the black. Tonight's performance was, in theory, a small thing. Pretend to be the old fool everyone already thought I was. Let them think the ship had no captain. Kenji lifted his cup in a casual salute, then turned his head slightly, as if considering the DA Corps. When he spoke again, his voice dropped, not in volume so much as in tone. The English evaporated. In its place came the smooth, rapid cadence of Japanese. Kawaii so na soru da na, he said lightly, eyes still on the wall behind me. Look at this poor old monkey. My jaw did not so much as twitch. I stared at the grain of the table as though it held all the mystery of the universe. His gaze flicked back to my hands, studying the deliberate tremor. Tiga fururu, he added, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough for Lydia to see. Look at his hands shake. How do you stand touching him? I can almost smell the hospital on him from here. The words slid into my ears and down my spine like ice water. For a heartbeat, the restaurant around me dissolved. I was 29 again, in a cramped Tokyo office. Sweat prickling beneath my cheap suit while a line of stone-faced men debated in rapid Japanese whether I was too nervy to survive their world. Back then, I had hidden my understanding until it became a knife I could lay quietly against their throats. Lydia's laugh chimed across the table. She didn't answer him in Japanese. Her vocabulary was a tourist's, picked up from spa menace and anime subtitles. But she didn't need to. The sound was bright and cruel and eager. Oh, stop, she said in English, swatting the air. You're terrible. She did not ask what he had said. She did not care. She only cared that he was laughing at me and that she could bask in the reflected scorn. I swallowed once, carefully, and let my fingers exaggerate their tremor. The water in my glass wobbled. A single drop leapt over the rim and landed on the white linen, blooming into a tiny, shapeless stain. Kenji took another sip of sake, then leaned back. His eyes tracked the room lazily, found no one paying us particular attention, and slid back to Lydia. The Japanese returned, softer now, like velvet covering a blade. "Che ni doku o I reach shiminasai," he murmured. "Just poison his tea already. Or push him down the stairs. How much longer do you expect me to wait to enjoy our little fortune?" For the first time that evening, my grip really did falter. The chopsticks in my other hand slipped, clattering against the plate with a sharp, accusing sound. Lydia startled and shot me a quick look of irritation that she smoothed into concern as soon as Kenji glanced over. "Harrison," she said softly, "you're making a mess." "I'm sorry," I whispered, letting the apology rattle out of me with a hint of breathlessness. I dabbed at the table with my napkin, my motions small and shaky. Inside, the world I had been living in for the past 10 years cracked down the middle. It was not just that she laughed while another man talked casually about murdering me. It was the way she leaned toward him, the way her pupils dilated when he said our little fortune, as if my life's work were already theirs to spend. A decade in Tokyo. 10 years of dawn negotiations in smoke-filled izakayas, of bowing deeper than men I despised so they'd underestimate me. 10 years of listening to what was not said as carefully as to what was. I had learned then that the moment you react is the moment you reveal what you know. And knowledge, if you are patient, can be converted into almost anything. So I did not react. Not outwardly. I let my shoulders sag. I let my gaze drift past Kenji's face as if I had missed whatever had just transpired. I mumbled something about needing the restroom and promptly forgot to stand. Kenji smiled in my direction with polite emptiness. He tipped his cup toward me and said, in English now, "To your health, Mr. Caldwell." Then, under his breath, barely moving his lips, he finished in Japanese. "Hayaku shine. Jikan ga nai zo." Hurry up and die. The clock is ticking. Lydia's hand tightened around my arm in what the room would read as support. I gave him the blank, blinking stare of a man who might not remember this dinner by morning. On the inside, my vision sharpened until I could see every pore on his carefully moisturized skin. They thought I was confused. In that moment, I had never been more awake. That night, over a plate of $200 steak I could barely taste, I understood that the life I had been living was already gone. But what they didn't understand was that I had not come to the end of my story. I had just turned the page to the beginning of a war. I was not born into the kind of room where men drink sake that costs more than a week's wages. I came into the world in a third-floor walk-up over a laundromat in Newark. The kind of place where steam curled out of the vents year-round, and the smell of detergent and boiled cabbage seeped into your clothes no matter how often you washed them. My father worked the docks when there was work and drank when there wasn't. My mother scrubbed floors in other people's houses and came home too tired to do much more than heat a can of soup and fall asleep in her chair. Money, in those days, was something other people had. What we had was rent due, shoes with cardboard soles, and a small, hard determination not to be crushed completely. I watched ships come and go from the harbor, their hulls stacked with containers painted in colors that looked wild against the gray water. As a boy, I used to stand on the pier and stare up at those floating cities, listening to the creak of metal and the shouts of men in languages I didn't recognize, and think, someone owns all of this. Someone is getting rich every time one of these moves. I decided, long before I knew what the word entrepreneur meant, that if there was money to be made moving things across water, then I would find a way to claw a piece of it for myself. It didn't happen quickly. Nothing worth having ever does. I started as a clerk in a freight office, the kind of job where your name is just a voice that answers the phone and your body is an extra chair in a room full of papers. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes on everything. I learned the difference between a man who complains when a shipment is delayed and a man who quietly starts diverting his cargo elsewhere. When the company needed someone willing to relocate to Tokyo for a year to see what we can do over there. A job nobody with a family and a mortgage wanted, I raised my hand. 1 year, Harrison, my boss had said, clapping me on the shoulder. You help us get a foothold, we'll take care of you. And if it doesn't work out, well, you'll at least have some good stories. Japan was supposed to be an adventure. It became my crucible. The first few months were a blur of jet lag and incomprehensible meetings, of bowing at the wrong times and misreading faces that remained politely blank no matter what was at stake. I couldn't read a street sign on my own. I got lost in Shinjuku Station so many times the station guard started greeting me like an old friend. But I learned. I took classes at night. I sat in smoky bars with junior managers who were willing to speak slowly if I bought the drinks. I listened to what people said when they thought I didn't understand. Slowly. The rapid syllables stopped sounding like random noise and started arranging themselves into meaning. There is a moment when a foreign language clicks in your mind, when you realize you've been standing in a room full of closed doors and suddenly one of them swings open. I walked through and did not look back. The 1 year turned into 5, then 10. I negotiated contracts in back rooms that never appeared on any official floor plan. I made deals with men who shook your hand warmly, and then spent the next 6 months trying to find a way to knife you without getting blood on their shoes. I built routes others said were impossible, threading our ships through ports that had been deemed too corrupt, too dangerous, too unstable. We prospered. When my employer grew timid, worried about political risk in the region, I bought out their interest with money borrowed at rates that should have terrified me. I signed my name to notes that could have buried me if even one of those routes had gone bad. They didn't. By the time I was 45, the boy who grew up over a laundromat owned a small fleet of cargo vessels and an office tower with his name on the lease. By 50, I had a controlling interest in a global logistics firm. Men like Kenji used to bring me contracts and ask, very politely, if they might carry some of my freight. Through all of it, there was Margaret. I met her on a day when a typhoon was curling toward Okinawa and the markets were melting down. She was not a model or a socialite. She was a schoolteacher from Queens who thought the whole business of shipping containers and derivatives sounded mildly insane. She listened to me talk about trade lanes and tax treaties, smiled, and told me I needed to eat a vegetable and call my mother. She was the first person in my adult life who didn't seem impressed or intimidated by what I did. She just cared whether I came home in one piece. We were married for 32 years. She saw the first big contracts, the first ship I bought outright, the day we rang the bell at the exchange. She also saw the nights I came home smelling like cigarette smoke and despair, because a deal had collapsed at the last moment or a storm had taken a ship off course. She never once asked me how much I was worth. She asked me whether I was sleeping, whether my back hurt, whether I'd remembered to call our daughter. Our daughter. Claire. My greatest point of pride and my deepest source of guilt, depending on when you catch me thinking about her. She came along just when the business started to take off. A tiny, squalling reminder that there were more important things than shipping manifests. I missed more of her recitals and games than I like to admit, but I always tried to be there when it counted. Margaret made sure of that. She had a way of looking at me over her glasses that could make a billionaire feel like a truant schoolboy. Then, one spring, Margaret found a lump. We caught it early, we did all the right things, and still, within 2 years, I was standing beside a grave with a black umbrella, listening to a priest talk in circles about God's plan, while the woman who had anchored my life was lowered into the ground. The house became too quiet. Work filled the gaps it could, but not all of them. We humans are not designed to echo our own footsteps forever. I was 62 when Lydia breezed into my life at a charity gala, all red silk and champagne laughter. Her hand extended as if we'd been dancing around each other in crowded rooms for years. She told me she'd always admired men who built things. She listened to my old war stories as if they were blockbuster movies. She laughed at my jokes, touched my arm when I spoke, and looked at me like I was still the man in his 30s, who had first stepped off the plane in Tokyo, hungry and unafraid. Was there a part of me that knew she was too good to be true? Of course. I am not stupid. Even then, I saw the way her eyes lingered on other men's watches, the way she lit up when a photographer turned her way. The way she mentioned, a little too often, how hard her childhood had been and how much she hated the idea of being poor again. When she made a face at a gray-haired senator fumbling for his speech notes and muttered, "Men should know when to step aside," I felt a small, sharp pang. But I was a widower who had spent 3 years eating takeout in front of the television and waking up reaching for a hand that wasn't there. When a beautiful woman in her early 40s looks at you like you are the only man in the room, it is astonishing how quickly you can convince yourself that love has simply come in a different package this time. I told myself the jokes about older men and younger wives didn't apply to us. I told myself that her taste for designer shoes was just a generational thing. I told myself her subtle impatience with my stories about Claire was because she hadn't had children of her own and didn't know what to say. "Your daughter seems intense," she would murmur, swirling her wine. "I worry she only calls when she needs something. You deserve peace, Harrison. At your age, stress is dangerous for your heart." At first, I defended Claire. Then, slowly, insidiously, I started to wonder. When a phone call from my daughter left me with a headache after an argument about the company's succession plan, Lydia was there with a cool cloth and a soft voice. "See," she whispered. "You get so worked up. She doesn't understand how fragile you are now." Fragile. It was a strange word to hear applied to a man who had once stared down armed strikers on a dock in Busan. But I was older. My knees ached in the winter. My back complained if I sat too long. I had survived a minor heart scare at 68 that landed me in a hospital bed for 3 nights with monitors beeping at my head. The cardiologist told me I was lucky. Lydia told me I had to stop trying to be the man I used to be. So I let her take over small things, then bigger ones. She started handling the social calendar. You get confused with all the dates. Darling. She managed the household staff. They listened better to me. When my eyesight made reading fine print a chore, she offered to go through the bank's statements and legal documents. "Just sign here, love. It's the renewal for the trust we discussed." I signed. I had spent a lifetime reading every clause twice. Now I let my hand move where she guided it, distracted by the way her perfume curled around me, by the warmth of her knee against mine under the table. The irony is that for all her talk of my fragility, I am still stronger than she pretends I am. I drive myself to the club when she's too busy to join me. I walk the estate grounds every morning without a cane. My mind, when it is not fogged by whatever pills that obliging quack prescribes, is as sharp as it has ever been. I forget names more often than I like, but I remember numbers like they're carved into stone. I can still close my eyes and recite the tonnage and turning radius of every ship I ever owned. Yet to the outside world, to our friends, her friends now, I am the frail old man in the corner seat, the the one whose wife kindly explains things to him. They lower their voices when they speak to me, enunciating carefully, as if English has become a second language to me instead of Japanese. What is truly at stake now that I have seen what I have seen? Not just the money, though there is plenty of that. Not just the majority stake in the company that still bears my name, or the houses scattered across continents, or the paintings on the walls. Those can be quantified, insured, moved. What they are trying to take from me is harder to price. My dignity. My right to decide how I spend the last years of my life. The story that will be told about who I was and what I built. The future I imagined for Claire, who, for all my failings, is still my blood and my rightful heir. They are trying to erase me before I am even gone and redraw the picture so that Lydia stands at the center, weeping prettily over her tragic, confused husband as she signs away his legacy to a man who calls him a monkey. I had spent a lifetime navigating storms at sea, believing the worst weather I would ever face would have waves in it. I did not realize, until that dinner, that the most dangerous storm of all would be sitting across from me at my own table, smiling over the rim of a sake cup. Once you see the pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. Before that dinner, I had thought of it all as a series of small kindnesses, slightly overbearing gestures from a woman who loved me too much to trust that the world wouldn't snatch me away. Afterward, each moment unfolded in my memory like a photograph developing in a darkroom, details appearing where before there had been only vague shapes. It started as so many traps do, with concern. After the heart scare, when a tightness in my chest had landed me in a hospital bed under fluorescent lights that made everyone look half dead already, Lydia arrived each morning with fresh flowers and a stack of questions for the doctors. She held my hand and told them stories about how I'd worked too hard all my life, how I forgot to eat if she didn't remind me. When they mentioned my blood pressure, she pressed a hand to her mouth and said, "He's under so much stress. He explodes over the smallest things lately. I worry about his mind." I laughed it off then, chalked it up to her dramatic streak. The cardiologist gave me the standard lecture about diet and exercise, then referred me to a neurologist. Just to be thorough. Lydia clung to that referral like a lifeline. "Please, Harrison," she begged in the car on the way home. "For me. I know you feel fine, but what if something is starting and we catch it too late?" I was tired, sore, and not in the mood to argue. I agreed. Saying yes is always easier than saying no when you are exhausted and someone is playing the part of devoted spouse like an Oscar is at stake. The neurologist's office smelled like lemon disinfectant and quiet panic. The walls were covered with brochures about memory care facilities and cheerful pamphlets explaining what to do if grandma starts repeating herself. The doctor himself was younger than my cufflinks, with kind eyes behind expensive glasses and a handshake that felt more like a survey than a greeting. "Your wife tells me you've been a bit more forgetful lately," he said after a few preliminary tests. Names, dates, maybe misplacing things. Lydia sat beside me, hands folded in her lap, looking appropriately stricken. "He left the stove on last month," she murmured, "and the other day he put his watch in the freezer. He laughs it off. But it scares me." I stared at her. The stove incident had been 15 years ago, when Margaret was still alive, and we'd both been too distracted by an argument about Claire to notice the burner. The watch in the freezer had been a joke, my own absent-mindedness on a day when I was jet-lagged out of my skull from a flight back from Singapore. I had told that story exactly once over wine, and we had laughed. Now it was evidence. The doctor nodded sympathetically. He ran me through a battery of questions. "What day is it? Who is the president?" Count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered them all, some with an edge of sarcasm I couldn't quite flatten. He frowned slightly, then smiled. "You're doing very well," he said. "Better than many men your age. But we know that changes can be subtle early on. I'd like to put you on a low-dose supplement. Think of it as vitamins for the brain. It might help with focus, and it certainly won't hurt." He scribbled something on a pad and tore it off. Lydia took the slip before I could, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her bag. "I'll handle the pharmacy," she said softly, as if paying for the pills were an act of heroism. The capsules arrived in an amber bottle with my name on the label and a benign sentence about cognitive support in small print. Lydia set them next to my plate every morning, next to my glass every evening. Don't forget your vitamins, darling, she'd say, tapping the bottle with a manicured nail. Doctor's orders. For a while, I didn't notice anything but a vague heaviness behind my eyes, an extra layer of cotton wrapped around the edges of my thoughts. I chalked it up to age, to post-surgery exhaustion, to jet lag that never quite left. On days when I was sharp despite the fog, Lydia would tilt her head and say, "Oh, you're in a good spell today. Yesterday you told me the same story twice, did I? Maybe?" Memory is a strange beast. The more you question it, the less solid it feels under your feet. It was the little corrections that wore at me. I would mention that I'd been thinking about calling my old friend Daniel in London. We had dinner with him last summer. I'd say, "I owe him a follow-up about that port deal." Lydia would blink slowly, pityingly. "Harrison, that was 3 years ago," she'd reply. "You're mixing things up again. We saw his daughter last summer, remember? In Paris, at the hotel bar. You left your cane there." I don't use a cane, I thought automatically, and then paused. Had I ever used one? No. But for a second, the image of myself hobbling along marble floors, leaning on polished wood, flickered so convincingly in my mind that I had to touch my own leg under the table to reassure myself. Whenever I asked about bank statements or legal documents, she had a story ready. "We renewed that trust last month. Don't you remember signing?" she would say, sliding a plate in front of me. "You were tired, it's okay if you don't." If I said I didn't recall a particular dinner, she'd sigh. "We talked about this already yesterday. I worry, you know. Your father had issues later in life. He didn't. He drank himself into stupors and fell off a pier at 59. But his memory remained razor-sharp until the day the ocean finally claimed him." Still, after the third or fourth time she brought it up, a splinter of doubt lodged under my skin. What if she saw something I didn't? What if the fog in my head wasn't just from those pills? Outside the house, the world shifted around me too. Staff I'd had for years began speaking to me more slowly, repeating themselves as if I were hard of hearing. The new driver opened the back door of the car and called me, "Sir," in a tone usually reserved for toddlers and the infirm. "Mrs. Caldwell said you shouldn't be driving anymore," he offered when I asked, mildly, why he'd taken my keys that morning. "For safety. The roads are tricky up here." The old friends I used to meet for lunch started texting less and less. When I finally reached one of them and asked why he hadn't called in months, he sounded genuinely surprised. "Lydia told us you weren't up to visitors," he said. "She made it sound like you barely recognized people some days." I didn't want to intrude. Claire's calls became rarer too, and when they came they were always bracketed by Lydia's commentary. "She rang while you were napping," Lydia would say as I walked into the kitchen. "But you were so confused last time. I told her you needed rest." Confused. It was her favorite word, right after fragile. On the days the pills hit harder and my thoughts slogged through mud, I started to think she might be right. I would stare at a document, the letters swimming just out of reach, and feel a cold line of panic trace my spine. Maybe this was how it began. Maybe all the storms, all the time zones, all the late nights had finally caught up. Then I'd remember a name, a number, a tiny detail from a negotiation in Osaka 30 years ago, and the panic would waver. Men losing their minds don't recall shipping rates from 1987. But the doubt remained, a bruise you poke just to see if it still hurts. One afternoon, months before the restaurant, I sat in the neurologist's office again while he reviewed my progress. Lydia did most of the talking. He wandered the garden for an hour yesterday, and then couldn't remember where he'd left his phone. She said, her voice tight with rehearsed worry. "He gets agitated when I correct him, and then he feels ashamed. It's breaking my heart." The doctor nodded, tapping at his tablet. "These changes can be very distressing," he murmured, looking at me with eyes that said, "I see this all the time. Have you noticed any difficulty managing finances, Mr. Caldwell? Complex tasks?" "I'm fine," I said. The words came out slower than I'd intended. The cotton was thick that day. He smiled in that specific way doctors do when they've decided you aren't the most reliable narrator of your own life. "It might be wise to start thinking about support structures," he continued. "We can talk about powers of attorney, perhaps a conservatorship down the line, just so your wife has the legal ability to help you if things progress." Conservatorship. I repeated, the word snagging. I had spent my career drawing up contracts, restructuring companies, navigating regulators, and yet here I was being spoken about as if I were a failing subsidiary to be managed. It's just planning ahead, he said smoothly. Your wife has your best interests at heart. At the time, I let it slide. Told myself it was prudent. Margaret would have insisted on contingency plans too. But sitting in that restaurant, listening to Kenji talk in Japanese about poisoning me, that entire conversation rewrote itself in my mind. Best interests, planning ahead, powers of attorney, conservatorship. After dinner, back at the house, these words echoed in the silence of my study. I sat behind a desk I had once negotiated into existence, surrounded by deal trophies and photographs of ships I no longer owned, and felt the pill fog in my head thicken like smoke. I picked up the amber bottle Lydia lined up with such care on my nightstand and held it to the light. The capsules rattled softly, innocent as candy. My hand shook, but not from age. If those pills were the only thing standing between me and the man I had been, then I needed to know whether they were helping me or hobbling me. The next morning, when Lydia's back was turned, I palmed the pill, walked into the bathroom, and watched it dissolve into a swirl of white in the toilet bowl. 3 days later, the fog had lifted enough that when I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and found a folder I didn't recognize, buried under old contracts and forgotten correspondence, I knew at once that it didn't belong. The label across the tab was crisp and News Caldwell Conservatorship Preliminary Petition. In the top corner, in small, neat type, someone had given it a code name Project Sunset. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were drawing up the paperwork to bury me alive. The night I found the folder, I did not sleep. I lay in bed beside Lydia, listening to the soft, even sound of her breathing, the faint rustle of silk each time she shifted. On my nightstand, the amber bottle of capsules sat in its usual place, the white label accusing me in the dim glow of the digital clock. Project Sunset. It sounded almost poetic, as if someone had taken the end of a man's life and rebranded it as a retirement plan. At 5 in the morning, when the house was still and the first gray light was just beginning to seep around the edges of the curtains, I swung my feet to the carpet and stood up. My head felt clearer than it had in months. That in itself was an answer. I picked up the bottle, unscrewed the cap, and poured a small blue cascade into my palm. For a moment I simply looked at them, these tiny, innocent shells I had accepted without question. Then I walked into the bathroom, tipped them into the toilet, and watched the water turn cloudy as they dissolved. Day 3 without meds, I thought. No dizziness, no cotton. The sentence assembled itself in my mind like a line from a logbook. I went back to my study, opened the bottom drawer, and took out an old leather notebook I hadn't used since Tokyo. The pages still smelled faintly of ink and cigarette smoke. Margaret used to tease me about keeping everything in my head. Japan had taught me the value of documentation. Tonight, those instincts came back like muscle memory. I dated the first blank page. Day 1, I wrote in small, precise letters. No pill this morning. Thoughts sharper. No tremor until I forced it. Recalled warehouse manager's name from 1984 without effort. Found Project Sunset. File filed under my own name. No recollection of signing any such petition. Possible forged consent or obtained under influence. Lydia's role central. I closed the book and tucked it behind a row of dull accounting texts no one had touched in years. Lydia wouldn't go near those shelves. She found numbers boring. A word she pronounced like a diagnosis. The irony did not escape me. If I was going to trust my mind again, I needed more than a journal. I needed a second opinion from someone who did not rely on Lydia's version of events. The neurologist she'd paraded me in front of was out of the question. I thought back to the Rolodex in my mental archives, the parade of doctors I had met over the years. Cardiologists, orthopedists, men who played golf at the club and occasionally glanced at my charts between holes. There was one name that surfaced more insistently than the others, Padel, an internist in his late 50s now, I imagined, who had once patched me up after a particularly idiotic attempt to lift a crate by myself in my warehouse days. He'd told me I was too stubborn for my own good and refused to bill me full price because, "Men like you built this city, Mr. Caldwell." We had lost touch over the years, but a man who sees you stubborn and bleeding and still conscious remembers you. Calling from the house phone was out of the question. Lydia had taken to helping by checking my recent calls and offering to dial for me. So I waited until she announced, one bright, brittle afternoon, that she was off to a salon appointment and that I was to rest and not wander off. "I'll have Thomas take you if you need anything," she said, kissing my forehead as if I were a child with a fever. "Promise me you'll stay put." "Of course," I murmured, letting my eyes drift toward the television. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her and the sound of her car faded down the drive, I picked up my old leather wallet and walked out the back way. Thomas, the new driver, straightened when he saw me. "Mrs. Caldwell said you were staying in today, sir," he said, frowning slightly. "Mrs. Caldwell," I replied, "forgets that I still own the deed to this house and the keys to that garage. I need a ride into town." Quietly. He hesitated. I saw the calculation flicker across his face. The new boss's instructions versus the name on his paycheck. I pulled a set of keys from my pocket and held them up. "I can drive myself," I added. "Your call. Either you come with me and say you insisted, or you explain to Lydia why you let a fragile old man get behind the wheel alone." His jaw worked for a moment, then he sighed. "Where to, sir?" "Manhattan. East Side. I'll give you the address on the way." An hour later, I was seated in a modest consultation room that smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Dr. Patel looked older, with more gray at his temples and deeper lines around his eyes, but the way he peered at me over his glasses hadn't changed. "I've been hearing about you," he said, folding his hands. "Friends at the club say you've been under the weather." "Friends at the club hear what my wife tells them," I replied. "I'd like to know what my brain tells you." He studied me for a long moment. "You think something is wrong." I think," I said carefully, "that something is being done to me, and I would prefer facts to rumors." He ran his tests. Different from the neurologists, more thorough, more nuanced. He asked me to remember lists, to draw shapes, to interpret proverbs. He asked about my daily routines, my business. The year Victor, our most troublesome competitor, had tried to undercut my rates on the Pacific routes. I gave dates, numbers, and names he himself had forgotten. Finally, he leaned back and set his pen down. "For a man your age," he said, "your cognitive function is excellent. Better than many 10 years younger. I see no evidence of dementia, early or otherwise." I felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. "And the pills?" I asked, taking the now empty bottle from my pocket and sliding it across the desk. He picked it up, read the label, and frowned. "Who prescribed these?" I told him the neurologist's name. "They are not harmful in small doses," he said slowly. "But taken over time they can cause fatigue, lightheadedness, and cognitive fog. I wouldn't recommend them for someone whose main complaint is occasionally forgetting where he left his reading glasses. So if someone wanted to make a man seem confused," I said, my voice very calm, "this would be a good start." His eyes met mine. Understanding, sharp and undeniable, passed between us. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "who handles your medications at home?" "My wife." I held his gaze. "And she insists I take every last one." On the drive back, the city blurred past the window. Brick and glass, old money and new grime. But I saw it with a clarity I hadn't possessed in months. The doubt that had gnawed at me, the whisper that maybe this was all just age catching up, quieted. In its place, something older and colder rose, a tide I recognized from my days in Tokyo when a rival had tried to starve my ships out of the harbor. At home, I went straight to my study. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. Day 5 without meds. Cognitive exam excellent. Pills unnecessary. Harmful even. Conclusion fog was induced, not natural. I underlined the last sentence twice. Shock came first, a raw animal thing that made my hands clench around the pen until my knuckles ached. The woman I had brought into my home, into my bed, had been collaborating, with a doctor, no less, to make me doubt my own mind. There is a particular cruelty in that, the assault not on the body but on the self. Guilt followed, slower but heavier. I thought of Claire's face the last time we'd argued, how she'd looked at me as if I were a stranger. "You used to ask my opinion," she had said, voice shaking. "Now everything has to go through her. Do you even hear yourself?" I had heard Lydia later, in the kitchen, clucking her tongue. She upsets you, she'd said. You can't afford that kind of stress, Harrison. Let me deal with her. I had let her. I had chosen the easy quiet over the difficult conversation, the soft hand on my arm over the angry voice on the phone. Now I saw that choice for what it was, the first brick in a wall separating me from my only child. Grief and regret could have swallowed me. For a while they tried. I sat there in my leather chair staring at the ink drying on the page, and felt all 70 years of my life settle on my shoulders. I could have raged, stormed into the bedroom, shaken Lydia awake, demanded explanations. I could have hurled the empty bottle at the wall and watched it shatter. That is what she would have wanted. A man who bursts into a room, waving accusations and half-formed theories, is easy to paint as unhinged. She would have widened her eyes, taken a fearful step back, called the doctor, called the lawyer. He's getting worse, she would have said. You see, he's paranoid now. He thinks I'm trying to hurt him. There would be notes in his file about delusions, about aggression. Project Sunset would accelerate. They would pat my hand, sedate me, for my own good, and wheel me out of my own life while I shouted the truth to people who had already been taught not to listen. No, if there is one thing years in Japan taught me, it is that the first person to raise his voice in a negotiation has already lost. Outrage is a luxury for men with less to lose. I could not afford it. So instead I made a different choice. I picked up the pen again and wrote, strategy: do not confront, confirm, observe, play role. From that day forward, I became, in public, exactly what Lydia said I was. I let my gaze drift during conversations. I asked people to repeat themselves more often. I forgot appointments and allowed her to chide me gently in front of others. I exaggerated the tremor in my hand when I lifted a glass. When she moved my keys and then asked if I'd misplaced them again, I blinked twice, frowned in confusion, and thanked her profusely when she found them. Each time I did, she relaxed a little more. So did the staff. So did the doctor. A man who accepts his own decline is not dangerous. He is manageable. He is clay softening in warm hands. Inside I sharpened. 2 days after my visit with Dr. Patel, I made another call. This one I placed from the landline in my locked study, the receiver heavy and familiar in my hand. I dialed a number I hadn't used in nearly a decade, half expecting it to have been disconnected. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Yeah, Sullivan, I said. It's Harrison. A pause. I could almost hear him sit up straighter on the other end. I'll be damned, he said. We heard you were well. We heard you weren't doing so good. I smiled, a small, humorless curve of my mouth that no one could see. The rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated, I replied. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly. I need your help. That's a sentence I haven't heard in a long time, he said slowly. What kind of help? The old kind, I said. Full review of my assets and any documents I've signed in the last 2 years. Quietly. I also need recommendations for someone who can install eyes and ears in my own home without leaving fingerprints. And if you know any medical experts who aren't on my wife's Christmas card list, I'd like a second and third opinion ready. On the other end, I heard the rustle of paper, the scrape of a chair. When Sullivan spoke again, his voice had the steel I remembered from Lady Night takeover battles. All right, Harrison, he said. If you're calling me, then it's serious. Send me what you have. We'll start digging. But I have to ask, are you sure you're up for a fight like this? At your age. I looked at the Project Sunset folder on my desk. I thought of Lydia's manicured finger pushing a pill bottle toward me, of Kenji's voice purring in Japanese about how I should hurry up and die. At my age, I said, my voice level, I don't have time for anything else. We hung up with a plan to meet in person under some benign pretext. I closed my notebook and returned it to its hiding place. Outside my study, I could hear Lydia moving around upstairs, drawers opening and closing as she prepared for another day of caretaking in front of an applauding audience. They mistook my silence for weakness. From now on, it would be my sharpest blade. I met Sullivan in the least dramatic place either of us could think of, the back corner of a quiet Italian restaurant we'd both been frequenting since deals were written on paper instead of screens. At lunch hour, it was filled with lawyers and bankers murmuring over pasta and mineral water. No one looked twice at two older men sharing a booth beneath a framed black and white photograph of Naples. He arrived 10 minutes early, as always, in a rumpled suit that somehow still managed to look expensive. His hair had thinned, his jowls sagged a bit more than I remembered, but his eyes were as sharp and suspicious as ever. "You look better than the rumors," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "You look worse," I countered. It broke the tension, and he chuckled, the sound low and rusty. We dispensed with small talk quickly. I handed him a slim leather folder containing copies of everything I could lay my hands on without alerting Lydia: bank statements, insurance policies, scanned pages from my supposed renewed will. On top, like a rotten cherry on a poisoned sundae, I laid the Project Sunset file. He flipped through, his frown deepening with every page. "Conservatorship petition," he muttered. "Proposed powers of attorney." "You sure you signed all this?" "I'm sure I signed something," I said. "What I thought I was signing isn't what ended up on the page." He looked up. "And the meds? Dr. Patel confirms they're not vitamins," I replied. "They're fog, prescribed unnecessarily, administered dutifully by my loving wife." Sullivan exhaled slowly and sat back. For a moment he just studied me, as if recalibrating a mental picture. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I need full access to your financials and any legal documents executed in the last 2 years. Not the versions your wife has in the pretty binders. The originals, or as close as we can get from the sources." "That will make noise," I said. "We'll make the right kind of noise," he countered. "We'll use routine pretexts. Internal audit, insurance review. Whatever excuse keeps Lydia away from the conversation. While I'm pulling threads on the paperwork, I want someone pulling threads on your house." "Surveillance," I said. He nodded. "You remember Donnelly, the narcotics guy?" I raised an eyebrow. "Thought he retired to Florida." "He retired from the force," Sullivan said. "Now he installs cameras for people who don't want to call the Yellow Pages locksmith. I'll have him in as a HVA technician, or some such. He'll plant ears where we need them, and, if we're lucky, in that investor's orbit too." We sketched the first draft of the plan between bites of linguine. It felt in a grim way like old times, strategizing a hostile takeover, mapping out pressure points and exit routes. Only this time, the company on the chopping block was my life. 2 days later, a white van with a heating company logo pulled into the driveway. Lydia, fanning herself in the late morning sun, met the uniformed man at the door. "Finally," she said, exasperated. "The downstairs vents have been acting up for weeks. Just don't bother my husband, he's resting." "Of course, ma'am," Donnelly said with a deferential nod that would have fooled a detective who didn't already know where to look. I sat at the kitchen island in my robe, a mug of coffee trembling in my hand. Lydia shot me an irritated glance. "Careful, Harrison," she said as he stepped past us. "You'll spill." "That's all right," I said, pitching my voice small. "I'll be more careful." Then I sneezed. The jerk of my arm sent the coffee flying. It splashed across the marble and into my lap. I yelped, more from the shock of heat than from any acting prowess. Lydia swore under her breath and rushed to the sink for towels. "For God's sake," she muttered. "You can't even hold a cup anymore." Donnelly paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, wife distracted, phone abandoned on the counter, the old man dripping and apologizing. He caught my eye for the briefest fraction of a second. I didn't move. I didn't have to. He was across the kitchen and 3 unhurried steps, his hand dipping as if to adjust his tool belt. In reality, he slipped a small device no bigger than a thumbnail under the lip of the counter near Lydia's phone charger. By the time she turned back, he was already unscrewing a vent cover above the stove, humming tunelessly. The entire operation had taken less time than it did for Lydia to say, "You're impossible," and shove a towel into my hands. That was how it went for days. I manufactured minor crises, a coughing fit in the hallway that sent her hurrying upstairs while her purse lay open on the hall table, a stumble on the back steps that brought the housekeeper running with both hands occupied. Each time, Donnelly or one of his men moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of ghosts, leaving behind ears in lampshades and eyes in the carved iris of the old wooden awl on the study shelf. Meanwhile, Sullivan dug. The first thing he sent me was a scanned copy of a power of attorney I did not remember granting. It bore my signature at the bottom, but the lines of my name wavered as if written on a ship in heavy seas. Above, in crisp legal language, it granted Lydia broad authority over my medical and financial decisions, in the event of mental incapacity as determined by a licensed physician. Dated 6 months ago. Sullivan's note read, witnessed by neurologist. Convenient. Next came an amended will I had never seen that reduced Claire's share to a token sum and left the bulk of my estate to Lydia, in gratitude for her years of devoted care. Filed but not yet activated. Of course, he added. These people aren't fools, they're careful vultures. In the evenings, when Lydia left the house for her pilates classes or dinner with friends, always with a performative kiss on my forehead and a reminder not to wander, I went to my study, closed the door, and put on a pair of headphones connected to a device Donnelly had tucked into the drawer beneath my pens. At first, the recordings were mundane Lydia complaining about my moods, Kenji flattering her, the maid muttering in Spanish about the laundry. Then, gradually, the conversations shifted. Comfort breeds carelessness. They assumed the microphones were in my head, not in the walls. One night, I listened to Lydia and Kenji at some rooftop bar, the clink of ice in their glasses punctuating every contemptuous sentence. I doubled the dosage this week, Lydia said, the slight distortion of the recording unable to blunt the gleeful edge in her voice. He stared at the TV for 20 minutes, thought the remote was the phone. Called me Margaret twice. My dead wife's name in her mouth was a desecration. Kenji laughed, low and satisfied. Perfect. The more confused he appears, the less anyone will question when the doctor signs off. Hazuki agreed. His concerned, she mimicked, then dropped into her own voice again. But yes. He'll put early dementia in the report. He keeps looking at me like he wants to apologize, but he likes his new lake house too much to grow a conscience now. There was another call, this one between Lydia and the neurologist himself. Donnelly's tech wizardry had cloned her phone so cleanly that I heard the ring, the nervous shuffle of papers, the guilty hesitation in the doctor's tone. We shouldn't rush this, he said. Cognitive decline is a serious diagnosis. You said yourself that it's better to plan ahead. Lydia replied, the same sugar-coated urgency she used when asking me to sign things. You've seen how he gets. The confusion, the outbursts. I'm just trying to protect him. The court will want your opinion. Silence. Then the quiet sound of a man compromising with his fear. I'll finalize the report, he said. Just make sure he doesn't read it. Trust me, she answered. He can barely read the newspaper anymore. In my study, the stack of business journals I devoured that morning sat within arm's reach. I could have hurled one at the wall. Instead, I wrote down the date, time, and exact words in my notebook. The more I listened, the worse it got. I heard them discuss timelines, how soon they could push the conservatorship petition through the courts, how quickly they could move me to a nice facility where he'll be safe. They talked about my assets as if they were already liquidated, my office as if it were already redecorated. One night, over the sound of clinking cutlery in some restaurant, Lydia said, We'll have to sell the paintings. They depress me. I want something lighter. And we'll put a wine cellar where his silly library is. The ships will sell for more, Kenji replied. The brand name alone. Once I'm in control of the company documents, we can leverage that easily. That's the best part, she said. Once the court says he's incompetent, I can sign anything. He won't even know. That was when I knew listening alone was not enough. Proof was only as useful as the power you had to act on it. If they managed to lock me away, if they gained control of my accounts, proof would be a story I told the walls. So, quietly, systematically, we began to remove the teeth from the beast they thought they were inheriting. Under Sullivan's guidance, I restructured my holdings. The company that everyone thought of as mine was, in legal reality, a web of subsidiaries, asset holding entities and trusts. Over the years, we had arranged it that way for tax efficiency and risk management. Now we use the complexity as a shield. We created a new trust, Nemesis Holdings, under the guise of philanthropic planning. Its beneficiaries were a foundation in my name and upon my death, Claire. Into Nemesis, we moved the patents on our most valuable logistics technologies, the titles to the ships still in operation, and the deeds to properties around the world. Quietly. Each transfer was routed through jurisdictions that prized privacy. By the time Lydia's conservatorship papers could have come before a judge, the crown jewels would be sitting in a vault she didn't even know existed. On paper, my personal accounts shrank. The balances redistributed into long-term instruments with restrictive covenants. The joint accounts she loved to dip into for handbags and spa weekends were left untouched, for now. An empty pantry doesn't attract rats. A half-stocked one keeps them complacent. It was not all signatures and spreadsheets. The emotional grind of it surprised even me. Hearing my wife's voice on those recordings, laughing about my shaking hands, like a party trick, planning what she would wear to the court hearing where they declared me unfit, made something physically hurt in my chest. Not the sharp, terrifying squeeze of a heart attack, but a deep, dull ache, as if a foundation stone in me had cracked. One afternoon, while Lydia was out, I listened to a recording of her talking to a friend. "Honestly," she said, "sometimes I think he's already gone. His body's there, but the man, he died with his first wife. I'm just managing what's left." I had to stop the playback and put my head in my hands. She was wrong, but the line cut close to a fear I hadn't named. That the best parts of me had gone into the ground with Margaret. For a few long moments, grief threatened to drown the anger. Then I remembered Claire's laugh when she was little. Her hand in mine on a pier as we watched the ships come in. I remembered the look on her face the last time we spoke, right before she hung up on me. "If you can't see what she's doing, Dad, I don't know how to help you," she'd said. I had seen now. Too late to take back the hurt I'd caused. But not too late to decide what kind of man I would be in the end. The confused old fool they wanted to write into the record, or the one who had once stared down storms on 3 oceans and survived. One evening, the answer to how soon they intended to move came in the form of a simple, chilling sentence delivered over a clink of ice. "We'll do it next month," Kenji said on the recording. "Get him to sign the last batch of papers when the sedatives are strongest. Then we move him into the facility that weekend. By Monday we can start consolidating the assets." "His birthday," Lydia replied, sounding delighted. "That's poetic, isn't it? A new chapter for everyone." In my study, the late light slanting across the desk, I paused the recorder. For a while I just sat there, listening to the quiet tick of the clock on the wall. They had picked a date. A neat little box on the calendar where they intended to erase me. I opened my notebook and wrote it down in a steady hand, circled it twice. They had set a date for my funeral. I decided, then and there, that it would be the date of their downfall instead. The beauty of a good trap is that it looks, from the inside, exactly like an opportunity. When I told Sullivan what I wanted to do, he leaned back in his chair and stared at me over steepled fingers. We were in his office this time, a paneled room that smelled of leather and old cigar smoke, the walls lined with the ghosts of past mergers and acquisitions. "You want to sell them air," he said finally. "For real money." "I want them to believe they're buying a gold mine," I replied. "And I want them to borrow every dollar they can get their hands on to do it." He tapped the edge of his desk with one finger. "You know the irony. If this deal were real, they still wouldn't deserve it. But as lies go, it's elegant." He sighed, then reached for a legal pad. "Right? Let's build them a fantasy. We called it Project Leviathan, because if you're going to invent a monster, you might as well give it a name with teeth." On paper, it was a memorandum of understanding between my old company and a government agency so bland its acronym sounded made up. It referenced preliminary approval for a contract to manage logistics for a multi-year defense initiative in the Pacific. The numbers were breathtaking, hundreds of millions over 5 years, with options to renew. The kind of deal that would make a man like Kenji salivate. Sullivan drafted it with the meticulous care of a jeweler setting counterfeit diamonds. The clauses were plausible, sprinkled with enough jargon and references to real regulations to withstand a cursory glance. The letterhead was perfect. The signatures at the bottom were from names that existed, men Sullivan knew personally, though they had not actually signed anything. He had their autographs on file from unrelated documents and, with some old-fashioned cut and paste, made them bless our fiction. "This will not stand up to forensic scrutiny," he warned, sliding the pages into a bright red folder stamped confidential across the front. If anyone calls the agency, the whole thing collapses. They won't call, I said. Men like Kenji don't like to share hot tips. He'll be too eager to keep this to himself. We scheduled our final meeting about Project Leviathan for a Tuesday. I made sure Lydia knew about it in the vaguest possible terms. More boring lawyer stuff. I said at breakfast, buttering my toast with exaggerated care. Something about expanding operations. I can't keep it straight. She froze for half a second, knife hovering over her own plate. Operations, she repeated. At your age. I smiled vaguely. Sully says there's still life in the old dog yet. Her eyes narrowed. Sullivan. You've been seeing him again. He says it's good to review legacies. I said. Before. I let the sentence trail off and let my gaze wander toward the window. Her hand tightened on the knife. When I returned that afternoon, I made a small production out of coming through the front door with the red folder tucked under my arm. I paused in the foyer, as if suddenly unsure where I had meant to go, then shuffled down the hall toward my study. Lydia watched from the living room doorway, pretending to be engrossed in her phone. In my study, I made a show of clearing a space on the desk. I set the folder down with too much care, as if it weighed more than paper should. I opened it just enough that the top page, with its official-looking seal, was visible. Then I closed it halfway, as if I had remembered at the last second that some things should not be left lying around. I fussed with a few pens, muttered aloud about details, and then, in a nice piece of unintentional theater, I knocked my reading glasses to the floor. Damn it, I mumbled, bending slowly, letting the effort look like more of a struggle than it was. I retrieved the glasses, set them on the desk, and then, importantly, did not lock the door when I left the room. I pulled it mostly shut, leaving a gap just wide enough to betray a guilty conscience. Upstairs, I sat in the armchair by the bedroom window and took out my tablet. Donnelly's camera feed blinked to life, displaying the study from the unblinking eye of the carved owl on the bookshelf. For a while, nothing happened. The house settled around me, wood ticking as it cooled, pipes sighing like old men. Then the door to the study eased open, just a crack at first, then wider. Lydia slipped inside barefoot, moving with the exaggerated stealth of someone who has never actually had to sneak before. She paused, listening. When she was satisfied I wasn't lurking in a corner, she walked straight to the desk. On the screen, I watched her see the folder. Her hand hovered over it for a heartbeat. She looked toward the door again, then, with a small, hungry smile, flipped it open. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page. Her lips moved silently over the words government, contract, projected value. Her chest rose and fell faster. She turned the page, kept reading, one hand already groping for her phone. I could almost hear her thoughts from upstairs. This is why he's been seeing Sullivan. This is what he's been hiding. This is what he was going to keep to himself. She snapped photo after photo. The artificial shutter clicks loud in the quiet room. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully, trying to match its angle to the outline in the dust. Then she slipped out of the study and closed the door gently, as if the paper inside might wake up and cry. My tablet buzzed a minute later, signaling a new audio capture from her cloned phone. I switched feeds and listened as she walked fast down the hall to the guest room she'd claimed as her own. Kenji, she hissed as soon as the line connected. Pick up. Pick up. There was the muffled sound of a man answering groggily. What time is it? Doesn't matter, she said. I just saw something in his study, something he didn't tell us about. He was with Sullivan today. They drafted a contract, a huge one. Government, logistics. You need to see this. She sent the photos. I heard the ping on his end, the rustle of sheets as he sat up. Then a sharp intake of breath. Is this real? He demanded. Are you sure? It looks real, she said. The seal, the numbers, everything. He was acting all confused about operations at breakfast, but he looked excited. You know how he gets that stupid little smile when he thinks he's being clever. Kenji swore softly in Japanese. If this is signed while he still controls the company, the valuation will triple. Maybe quadruple. Once the market hears. Exactly, Lydia said. If we wait for the conservatorship and they do a full audit, they'll see this and price it in. We'll never afford to buy him out. We have to do it before it's signed. There was a pause as he did mental arithmetic I'd been doing for decades. I can raise more capital, he said slowly. If I can tell my backers there's an imminent government contract, they'll throw money at me. But I need control. Full control. That's what Project Sunset is for, she replied. We'll push the doctor. We push the paperwork. Get him declared incompetent, get me power of attorney, and then we sign the sale with you before this contract goes public. We skim the upside. He drools in a nice facility while we drink champagne. I watched her pace on the tiny screen, her bare feet ghosting over the rug, her free hand fluttering as she spoke. There was a brightness in her voice I hadn't heard even on our wedding day. It wasn't love. It was greed, pure and uncomplicated. Kenji's tone shifted. The lazy charm I'd seen at the restaurant gave way to something harder. All right, he said. I'll start the calls. Banks first, then other sources. This will be tight, high interest. But with this contract in my pocket, I can pay them back twice over. If we move fast, Lydia urged. He's still up and down. Some days he seems sharp and it scares me. I don't want him getting any ideas. He's on the pills, Kenji said dismissively. He won't see it coming. Upstairs. I smiled without humor and wrote in my notebook, hook swallowed. The next week was a study in contrasts. On the surface, life in the house went on as usual. Lydia flitted between charity meetings and spa appointments, dabbing at the corners of her eyes and lamenting my good days and bad days to anyone within earshot. I shuffled through the rooms in my slippers, misplacing objects on purpose, asking what day it was a beat too late. When she corrected me, I thanked her as if she'd just pulled me back from the edge of a cliff. Below the surface, the water churned. Donnelly's reports described Kenji's movements with clinical precision. He requested meetings with multiple banks, was spotted entering the discreet side doors of private lenders whose clientele tended to arrive in unmarked cars with tinted windows. There were phone calls at odd hours to numbers that traced, through a web of shell companies, to men known for lending at interest rates that came with broken kneecaps as late fees. They're checking collateral, Donnelly told me over a secure line. He's offering them his personal holdings in Tokyo. A house in Oyama, an office building in Roppongi. He's all in. Good, I said. The more he ties himself to this, the less room he has to wriggle out. At the same time, Lydia accelerated her part of the plan. She badgered the neurologist for the finalized report, her voice on the recording sticky with feigned desperation. He wandered into the garden at midnight. She lied. He thought it was noon. He doesn't recognize our housekeeper half the time. Please, doctor. I can't do this alone. If something happens, I need to be able to act. The report, when it came, was a masterpiece of hedged language that nonetheless ticked every box the court would want to see. Early cognitive decline, episodes of disorientation, impaired judgment in complex decisions. It recommended protective legal measures, including assignment of durable power of attorney to a trusted caregiver. He wants to get him declared incompetent as soon as possible, Sullivan said, sliding a copy across his desk toward me. He seeks your wife's attorney. Let them, I replied. We'll be ready. We brought in one more player at that point, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit. A woman named Miller who had once opened an investigation into one of my rivals and watched it fizzle when the man died under suspiciously convenient circumstances. I don't want you to bend the law for me, I told her when Sullivan introduced us in his office. I just want you to be standing in the right place when it snaps back on them. She listened to a few carefully curated recordings, enough to confirm the outlines of elder abuse and fraud, then nodded once. If half of what you're saying is true, she said, they're doing me a favor by being greedy. Call me when the money moves. We'll be nearby, back at home. Lydia floated the next step with all the fox casualness of a cat suggesting the mouse lie down for a nap. One of the forms the doctor mentioned finally came through, she said one morning, sliding a clipboard toward me at the breakfast table. The top page was a bland sheet of legalese with a signature line at the bottom. The power of attorney language was buried on the second page, printed in smaller font. It's just so I can talk to your doctors, handle little things if you're ever in the hospital again, she said, buttering her toast. Standard stuff. You always told me to plan ahead. I lifted the pen, let it hover, then let my hand start to tremble. The nib scraped uselessly across the margin. I should read it, I murmured. My father always said. She snatched the clipboard back, her eyes flashing for a moment before she smoothed her expression. Your father's been dead for 30 years, she said. You trust me, don't you? I let confusion cloud my face. Of course, I said. Of course. I do, what was I signing again? Her lips thinned. You're having a bad day, she announced as if to some invisible audience. That's okay. We'll try again later, when you're calmer. We repeated that dance 3 times over the next week. Each time I balked at the last second, citing dizziness, fatigue, a vague sense of unease. Each time she grew a little more frustrated, a little more insistent. On the recordings, she vented to Kenji. He's being stubborn, she snapped. He has these flashes where he's almost himself. It's infuriating. Give him more of the pills, Kenji suggested. Enough to keep him under for the signing. You only need his hand to move, not his brain. They didn't realize the pills were already swirling in some distant sewer. The fog that remained was their own, not mine. Eventually, the date crystallized my birthday. A neat cover for a family gathering, a convenient excuse for lawyers to appear with documents, as a little routine housekeeping gift. Lydia presented it to me with a bright smile. We'll have a small party, she said. Just us, a few close friends. Maybe the doctor will stop by to toast to your health. And afterward, there are just a couple of things the lawyers need you to sign. Flu forms, tax forms, boring things. We'll get them out of the way so you can relax. I nodded slowly as if struggling to process. Flu forms, I repeated. Tax, she said, patting my hand. We'll keep it simple. You won't have to worry about a thing. Later that night, in my study, I watched the bank notifications scroll across the secure screen Sullivan had set up for me. A large sum, far larger than any legitimate business transaction warranted, had just hit an escrow account in my name from an entity linked, through a maze of intermediaries, to one of Kenji's lenders. The sale price they'd agreed on, based on the inflated valuation created by Project Leviathan, would wipe out his personal liquidity and bind him to obligations he could never repay if the underlying assets turned out to be smoke. Money's in place. Sullivan's message read. Transfer documents ready. Your company's shell is polished and hollow. Say when. I closed the laptop and sat back. In the window's reflection, I saw not the frail old man Lydia paraded in front of her friends, but the younger version of myself who had stared down unions and syndicates on foreign docks. The man who'd learned that sometimes you don't need to outshoot your enemy. You just need to let him jump off a cliff he's convinced is a bridge. The next morning, as Lydia straightened my tie with the brisk tenderness of a nurse preparing a patient for visitors, she smiled. Tomorrow, she said, we'll just do a quick signing. It's just for your health forms. After that, you can rest. Everything will be taken care of. I let my eyes drift, let my mouth sag in something like gratitude. Tomorrow, I echoed softly. Inside, the thought was a different creature entirely. Tomorrow they think they'll finally own me. They don't know that by tomorrow they'll own nothing at all. They staged my execution in the grand hall. Lydia had insisted on using that room, of course. The ceiling arched high overhead, coffering funneling the light from a crystal chandelier that had once hung in a Viennese hotel. The table beneath it was a slab of mahogany so heavy it had required 6 men and a special crane to bring it into the house. I had signed my first public stock offering at that table. Tonight, they meant for me to sign myself out of existence. They had even brought a chair with wheels, a sleek modern wheelchair that did not belong to me. Positioned at the head of the table like a throne someone had decided to bolt to the floor. Lydia fussed over me as she pushed me into place, adjusting the blanket over my knees for effect. Careful with the wires. She murmured to no one in particular, as if I were attached to unseen machines. He gets confused when there are too many people. There were plenty of people. To my right sat a young escrow officer in an impeccable suit, his laptop open, a small green light winking on his secure token. Next to him, the notary, her stamp resting on a leather pad. Eyes already scanning the pages in front of her. On my left, 2 junior associates from Sullivan's firm shuffled papers and tried to look unimportant. They knew more than they appeared to. but for now they played the part of administrative furniture. At the far side of the table, his back to the fireplace, Kenji Sato leaned back in his chair as if this were a casual lunch instead of the culmination of a criminal conspiracy. He wore a three-piece suit in charcoal that probably came from Milan, tie knotted with unnecessary perfection. His cufflinks flashed when he lifted his hand to check his watch. If he was nervous, he hid it beneath a layer of smug satisfaction. "Mr. Caldwell," he said as I was maneuvered into place. "Happy birthday. You look well." His English carried no hint of the contempt I had heard in his Japanese. To the untrained ear, he sounded respectful, almost deferential. I let my gaze slide past him and land somewhere near the window, my eyes unfocused. My hands lay limp on the blanket, fingers curled in on themselves. Lydia took the seat closest to me, angling her body so she could be both my interpreter and my keeper. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "We just want to get some routine paperwork done, so Harrison doesn't have to worry about anything if his health, well, you know." There were murmurs of polite sympathy from the notary and the escrow officer. No one challenged the narrative. Why would they? To them I was just another old man with too much money and too many medical appointments. On the table, 3 stacks of documents waited. The first was the conservatorship petition, dressed up as a generic health care directive. The second, buried deeper, was the durable power of attorney that would hand Lydia the keys to my life. The third, thickest of all, was the sale agreement transferring my controlling interest in the company to an entity fronted by Kenji. Sullivan, sitting slightly apart with a neutral expression, had drafted all of them. On the surface they were exactly what Lydia and Kenji believed them to be. Underneath, the wiring led elsewhere. "Mr. Caldwell," the escrow officer began, his tone careful, "I'm just going to walk you through the basics. We have received funds from Mr. Sato's investment group into the agreed-upon escrow account. Once you've signed these documents, we'll release those funds to your designated account, and the shares in your company will transfer to his entity. Do you understand?" I blinked slowly. Lydia squeezed my hand under the table, her nails digging into the thin skin on the back of it. "He has good days and bad days," she said with a rueful smile. "Today is middling, but we've discussed this, haven't we, darling?" I turned my head toward her, let confusion ripple across my features. "We talked," I murmured. "Yes," she said, a hint of steel beneath the sweetness. "Remember, you said you were tired, that you wanted someone younger to handle the business, that you trusted me to make sure everything went where it should." Her grip tightened as she picked up the pen and pressed it into my fingers. For a moment, the tremor returned. Not from acting this time, but from a flash of real anger. I let it show. To them, it was confirmation. "Just here?" she coaxed, guiding my hand toward the flagged line on the first document. "This says you want me to be able to talk to your doctors. Sign for you if you're ever too tired." My hand hovered. The room seemed to lean in. I could feel the notary's gaze, the escrow officer's polite impatience, Kenji's predatory focus. "I should read it," I whispered. Her smile flickered. "It's all things we've talked about," she said through clenched teeth. Under the table, her nails bit into my skin. "You trust me?" I let my eyes glaze. "Of course," I said. "Of course I trust." What was I signing again? A small, strained laugh rippled around the table. The notary shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. The escrow officer glanced at the clock. Time is money, and he had other appointments. "Harrison," Lydia hissed under her breath, low enough that only I could hear it. "Stop this. Sign the paper." She pressed my hand down. The pen tip met the page and skittered, leaving a shaky black line across the signature block. It wasn't my usual autograph, it was a caricature of one, the kind of scribble you'd get from a man whose mind was slipping away. That was by design. A signature executed under duress, a mental impairment, has a way of unraveling in court. "Good," she said brightly, releasing my hand. "One down." The escrow officer cleared his throat. "Now, on to the share transfer," he said, gesturing to the thicker stack. "Mr. Caldwell, this document confirms that you are selling your controlling interest in Caldwell Global Logistics to Mr. Sato's holding company at the agreed-upon price. Once you sign, I will release the funds to your account and title will pass." He tapped a few keys on his laptop. "The funds have been verified. We are holding them in escrow now. I could see Kenji's shoulders relax a fraction. The money was in play. To back out now would cost him dearly, even without the trap waiting at the end. Just a thumbprint will suffice. The notary interjected. Given the circumstances. She produced an ink pad and moved it toward me. Lydia seized my right hand again, almost eager. See, she said. They make it easy for you. Just your thumb, darling. Then all this will be over. She pressed my thumb into the ink, then guided it to the bottom of the page. I let it land, leaving a dark oval mark. Thank you, the notary murmured, already lifting her stamp. The escrow officer hit another key. All right, he said. Funds released to the account ending in 0341 as per your instructions, Mr. Caldwell. And the company's shares are now formally in the name of Sato International Holdings. There it was. The moment they had been working toward for months. On paper, I was no longer the majority shareholder of the company I had built. Kenji was. I watched his face as the numbers appeared on his screen. For a heartbeat, he looked like a man who has just seen salvation. Then he looked at me. Really looked. There was triumph in his eyes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. Mockery, perhaps, or anticipation of the freedom he imagined he'd just bought. He stood, smoothing his jacket, and walked around the table to where I sat slumped in the wheelchair. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, he said in English, his voice honeyed. You have made a wise decision. You can rest now. Leave the hard work to us. He bent close, his breath warm against my ear. In Japanese, so soft only I could hear, he added, You just sold your soul, old man, and you didn't even know it. I lifted my head. The act slipped off me like an old coat. My spine straightened, vertebrae stacking one atop another until I was sitting tall. The blanket slid from my knees. The tremor in my hand stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. I turned my head and met his gaze directly. Suka, I said in flawless Japanese. Saomaka, Sato-san. You really think so? The color drained from his face so fast it was almost comical. He lurched back as if struck, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing without sound. Behind him, Lydia let out a small, strangled noise. You speak? Kenji stammered. Better than you do, I replied, switching smoothly between languages. I spent 10 years in Tokyo while you were still learning your multiplication tables. I heard every word you said at that restaurant. Every joke about poisoning me, every insult about my hands, every plan to turn my office into your playroom. The room had gone very still. The notary's pen hovered above the paper. The junior lawyers stared openly now. Lydia's carefully constructed mask cracked down the middle, her painted lips trembling. Harrison, she said, her voice high and thin. You're confused. You're scaring me. Am I asked, turning to her. Let's clear that up. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a slim folder of my own. It was not red. It was plain and gray, the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic. I laid it on the table and flipped it open. First, I said, sliding a set of documents toward the center where everyone could see. The matter of what mystery Sato has actually bought today. I tapped the top page, a summary of asset transfers executed over the past months. Every patent, every ship, every piece of real estate, every significant account tied to Caldwell Global Logistics was transferred into Nemesis Holdings Trust, effective 3 weeks ago. Here are the filings. Properly recorded in all relevant jurisdictions. I glanced at the associates. You can verify the registrations. I encourage you to. One of them reached for the papers with shaking hands. His eyes raced down the lines, his pupils dilating. The operating company. I continued, looking back at Kenji, which you have just purchased at great personal expense, now owns office furniture, some leased equipment, and a charmingly catastrophic amount of debt. 43 million in short-term obligations, to be precise, also documented here. I slid another sheaf forward, loan agreements bearing his holding company's name. These, I said softly, are yours too, I believe. High interest, aggressive repayment schedules, and, if I'm not mistaken, secured by your personal properties in Tokyo, and by funds advanced from some less regulated lenders. Sweat beaded at his temple. His hand darted to his phone, stopped halfway, as if he realized there was no one he could call who wouldn't demand answers he couldn't give. You can't do this, he whispered. This is fraud. You deceived us. You conspired to drug an elderly man, fake his dementia, strip him of his assets, and lock him in a facility so you could spend his money. I returned. I simply chose to rearrange my own property before you arrived with your bucket. If you bought an empty well, that's not my fault. That's just bad due diligence. I nodded once toward Sullivan. He picked up a small remote from the table and pressed a button. From a discreet speaker hidden in the molding, a familiar voice filled the room, Lydia's, slightly tinny but unmistakable. "I doubled the dosage this week," she said. He stared at the TV for 20 minutes, thought the remote was the phone. Called me Margaret twice. There was a collective intake of breath. The recording continued, now with Kenji's voice overlapping. "Perfect," he said. "The more confused he appears, the less anyone will question when the doctor signs off." "Has he agreed?" "Oki will put early dementia in the report," Lydia replied. "He likes his new lake house too much to grow a conscience." The notary's hand flew to her mouth. The escrow officer's fingers froze on his keyboard. Detective Miller, who had been standing unobtrusively near the doorway in plain clothes, straightened just enough for me to see the flash of her badge under her jacket. "That's not," Lydia began. Sullivan hit another button. A second clip played, this one recorded over the clink of glasses. "We'll do it next month," Kenji's voice said. "Get him to sign the last batch of papers when the sedatives are strongest. Then we move him into the facility that weekend. By Monday, we can start consolidating the assets." "His birthday," Lydia answered. "That's poetic, isn't it? A new chapter for everyone," as their own words damned them. Lydia's composure shattered completely. "You set me up," she screamed, lunging to her feet. "You sneaky, ungrateful." She stopped herself just in time to avoid the word she wanted. But the hatred in it hung in the air anyway. The concerned caretaker was gone. In her place stood the woman I had heard on the recordings, cruel, impatient, convinced of her own entitlement. "You were going to die anyway," she spat. "You and your stupid ships and your boring stories. I gave you 10 years of my life. 10 years. You think that was charity?" Silence followed, heavy and electric. Detective Miller stepped forward, her badge now visible. "I think we've heard enough for today," she said calmly. She turned to Kenji. "Mr. Sato, I'm Detective Miller with the Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you some questions about your funding sources and your role in an attempted conservatorship fraud." Two uniformed officers appeared at the doorway as if conjured. Kenji looked around wildly, eyes landing on each exit and turn and finding them all blocked, not by force, but by the weight of his own decisions. "You can't arrest me," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm the victim here. He deceived me." "Hey!" He protected himself from a conspiracy to steal his assets by making sure there were no assets left to steal. Miller replied. "You, on the other hand, borrowed large sums from questionable sources on the assumption you'd be able to repay them with funds acquired through elder abuse. That's not a good look." Another pair of officers moved toward Lydia. She backed away. "Hands up." "I didn't mean it," she babbled. "It was just talk. We were joking. I love my husband. He's confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." I did it slowly, for my own satisfaction as much as for the drama of it. The blanket fell to the floor. The wheelchair creaked as I rose straighter than I had in months. I smoothed my jacket, adjusted my cuffs, and looked her in the eye. "I know exactly what I'm saying," I told her. "For the first time in a long while, I am not confused at all." The officers took her by the arms then, guiding her gently but firmly toward the door. Kenji, pale and sweating, was already being read his rights. The notary sat frozen, stamp forgotten in her hand. The escrow officer stared at his screen, as if trying to reconcile the numbers he'd just moved with the moral carnage unfolding around him. I picked up the sale document from the table, now bearing my inked thumbprint and the notary's seal, and folded it carefully. "Keep a copy for the file," I said to the junior associate nearest me. "Wouldn't want anyone to forget what happened here today." Then I turned my back on the wreckage at my own table and walked out of the room. Evil does not vanish when the handcuffs click. It lingers in paperwork, in late-night phone calls, in whispered conversations between men who lent money on the promise of impossible returns. But it does, eventually, meet something harder than itself. In the days after the signing, the house felt strangely hollow, as if someone had opened a window and all the noise had blown out. Lydia's perfume faded from the curtains. Her shoes no longer sat in accusing rows by the door. The silence was not peaceful at first. It was the silence after a storm filled with broken branches and standing water. Kenji did not go home that night. Detective Miller and her colleagues saw to that. He went instead to a holding cell, where the walls were cinder block and the mattress had no memory foam. While his lawyers scrambled to argue entrapment and misrepresentation, his phone, locked in an evidence bag, vibrated itself toward the edge of a shelf with messages from lenders who had seen the wire go out and wanted to know when it was coming back. It never did. They say his first real panic attack came not when he was charged with fraud, but when he realized that the company he now owned was not merely hollow, it was a whole. The contract's Nemesis holdings had stripped away were gone for good. The debts, however, remained fat and hungry. The men behind those high-interest loans did not file polite petitions in court. They sent representatives with quiet shoes and patient smiles. I did not need recordings to imagine those conversations. I had seen their like before. Some debts are paid in cash, others in pieces. Lydia's descent was less dramatic but, in its own way, more pathetic. The tabloids got hold of the story within a week. Wealthy socialite charged in elder abuse scheme, complete with an unflattering mugshot where her carefully constructed face drooped under fluorescent lighting. Her friends, the ones who had cooed over her devotion and praised her saintly patience, went very quiet. Charity boards discovered sudden conflicts of schedule. Invitations failed to arrive. The conservatorship petition she had so carefully assembled died on a judge's desk, suffocated by the evidence Detective Miller presented. The recordings, the forged documents, the medical report bought with a lake house. In its place came a different stack of papers, stamped with charges that carried real weight. Attempted fraud. Conspiracy. Administration of a noxious substance. Her lawyers tried to paint her as a misguided wife led astray by a foreign predator. The recordings made that difficult. In the end, she took a plea, trading Coucher for coarse fabric and cocktail parties for a schedule dictated by a corrections officer. The last I heard, she was assigned to laundry duty in a facility upstate, scrubbing other people's stains for pennies an hour. Somewhere a washer chugged in steady rhythm, not unlike the machines that had thumped below my childhood bedroom. Life has a sense of symmetry when it wants to. As for me, I did not stay in the big house. Once the forensics were done and the legal dust settled, the place felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum dedicated to other people's intentions. I sold it. Not to Kenji, obviously, and not to any buyer who had ever shaken his hand. The proceeds went, like so much else, into Nemesis. I moved into a smaller place overlooking the river. An apartment high enough that I could watch the cargo ships slide in and out of the harbor like patient beasts. I slept with the windows open when the weather allowed, the distant foghorns a lullaby I hadn't known I'd missed. The pills disappeared from my nightstand. My new doctor, recommended by Padel, prescribed nothing stronger than exercise and outrage in moderate doses. My calendar, once stuffed with meetings about other people's emergencies, now held only a few fixed points, calls with lawyers to tidy up the last of the legal threads, and a standing lunch on Tuesdays that mattered more than any shareholder briefing ever had. It took 3 voicemails and 1 letter to get Claire to agree to that lunch. She arrived at the restaurant wary, shoulders tight, eyes scanning my face for signs of the confusion she'd been told had claimed me. When she saw me stand to greet her, steady and clear-eyed, something in her expression crumpled. "You look like you," she said, sitting down slowly. "I thought," she told me. "I know what she told you," I said. "And I know what I let her tell you, by my silence. There are some apologies you cannot rush." We picked our way through ours like men crossing a half-collapsed bridge, testing each board before trusting it with our weight. I told her about the pills, about Project Sunset, about the recordings and the red folder. I admitted, without excuse, that I had been lonely and vain enough to let a stranger's flattery drown out my own daughter's warnings. I wanted to believe, I said, fingers curling around my water glass, because the alternative was admitting that I'd invited a vulture into my house. It was easier, for a while, to pretend I didn't see the bones piling up. She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the table and took my hand, the way she used to when she was small and the city streets felt too big. "You saw in the end," she said. You did something. That counts for something. When I told her about Nemesis, about how the real assets had been moved beyond Lydia's reach and would, one day, be hers to steward, she shook her head. I don't care about the money, she said. I care that you chose me over her, finally. I should have done it sooner. I admitted. Maybe, she said. But you did it while you still could. Some people never wake up at all. We began slowly to build something new. Not the simple bond we'd had when she was a child. Time and hurt make such innocence impossible. But a different, sturdier thing, hammered out of shared stubbornness and a mutual understanding that we had both, in our own ways, survived someone else's story about who we were supposed to be. In the quieter evenings now, when the city hums below and the river glows with scattered lights, I sit by my window and think about red flags. How easy they are to see in hindsight, bright as flares on a dark sea. How small and ignorable they seem in the moment, when you are tired and someone is offering you the comfort of not looking too closely. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that you should trust no one. A man who trusts no one dies alone in a room full of locks. The lesson, I think, is narrower and sharper. When your gut tells you something is wrong, treat it with the same respect you would give a storm warning on the open ocean. You don't have to abandon ship. You do have to check the hull. Document everything when people start telling you that you imagined what you just saw. Write it down when they say you misheard what you know you heard. Keep copies. Keep records. Not because the paper will save you on its own, but because memory is the first battlefield a liar tries to seize. And if you are older, if the world looks at your gray hair and slower step and decides that you are done, remember this age is not a weakness. It is armor built from every mistake you survived and every bad actor you learned to spot a second too late. It is a library of storms you've already sailed through. You do not stop being dangerous because someone else decides you should. They watched me slip into silence and thought it meant I had nothing left. They heard my quiet and called it confusion. What they didn't know is that silence, in the right hands, is not surrender. It is just the deep breath you take before the kill,